In the autumn of 1883, in the wind-scoured hill country of Montana Territory, a woman stepped down from a supply wagon in front of a ranch she had never seen, belonging to a man she had never met, to fulfill a promise that had been made to her by someone who did not exist. The wagon had come from the rail station at Cedar Ridge. The woman's name was Nora Whitcomb. She was 25 years old and had traveled 3 days from Missouri with a worn traveling bag, a letter of promise folded in her inside pocket, and the quiet courage of a person who has run out of other options and knows it. The letter said she was expected at Silver Creek Ranch, where a man named Amos Bell had written to ask for a wife. It spoke of a stable homestead, honest work, and the kind of life that a woman in Nora's circumstances would not have found in Missouri no matter how long she waited. The wagon stopped. The driver's name was Jasper Finch, and he had been edgy all the way from the station, answering her questions in monosyllables, keeping his eyes on the road with the concentrated attention of a man who does not want to talk. He unloaded her bag before she had quite finished climbing down, said the manifest showed Hollow Bend Ranch, and had the wagon moving again. Before she had time to look at the sign above the gate, the sign said Hollow Bend Ranch, not Silver Creek, not Amos Bell. Nora watched the wagon go. The dust settled behind it, the wind moved through the yellow grass. Somewhere in the distance, a gate hinge complained. She stood in front of a ranch she did not recognize, with a letter in her pocket, and no way back to anywhere, and she did not cry, because crying required a certainty about what had happened that she did not yet have. What she had was the letter. She took it out and read it again, slowly, the way you read a thing when you are hoping it will change. It did not change. A man came out from the direction of the stable. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years working without cover. His eyes were dark, and his expression was the expression of a man who keeps things to himself by long habit. He looked at her, then at the bag at her feet, then at her. His name was Garrett Lane. He had not sent any letter. He had not heard of Amos Bell or Silver Creek Ranch. He said so plainly, with the bluntness of a man who has learned that clarity costs less than kindness in the long run, and he read the letter she offered him with a careful frown that told her he was taking it seriously, even if he couldn't yet account for it. The sun was near the ridge. The temperature was dropping fast. Garrett Lane stood on the other side of a gate from a woman he had never seen, holding a letter that made no sense, and he looked at her for a long time. He was not a man who made decisions carelessly. He weighed things. He considered the consequences of what he did and did not do, and he had learned through experience that the consequences of doing nothing were always underestimated. He said she could not stand in the yard when the dark came. He tipped his hat back and told her to come inside, just for the night, and they would sort it out in the morning. Nora picked up her bag and walked through the gate. She did not know, stepping across that threshold, that she had just walked into the center of a scheme that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the man whose house she was entering. She did not know that the letter was a forgery. She did not know that Amos Bell was a name taken from a headstone in the abandoned cemetery north of town. She did not know that a man named Silas Creel, who ran the largest cattle operation in the valley and wanted the water rights that ran through Hollow Bend Ranch, had arranged for her to be deposited here, precisely because he knew the scandal of it would serve his purpose. She did not know any of it yet. What she knew was that the house was cold inside, but clean, in the way a house is clean when someone tends it without living in it. The girl who met her in the kitchen doorway was the first warm thing she encountered. She was perhaps 24, dark-haired, with careful eyes and the wariness of a person who had decided to stop trusting people until they earned it. Her name was Lydia Lane. She was Garrett's younger sister, and she had been living at Hollow Bend since the winter her own plans had come apart, and she had made herself useful in the way quiet people do, not by claiming space but by filling it steadily. Lydia looked at Nora. Nora looked at Lydia. Lydia said the guest room was at the end of the hall. That was all. But it was said without hostility, which in a house that cold was something. Nora did not sleep well. She lay in the narrow bed with the letter on her chest and read it again by moonlight, and she thought about the 9 months she had spent in Missouri since her parents died, being moved from one relative's house to another, each one a little less willing than the last, each one reminding her with increasing directness that she was a burden without particular charm, beauty, or property to recommend her. She had answered a dozen advertisements. She had written careful, honest letters. She had prayed in a small and practical way that was less about faith than about the absence of alternatives. She thought about the money she had spent on the train ticket, which was nearly all she had. She thought about what the letters said, and about the way Jasper Finch had not quite met her eyes. In the morning she got up before the house stirred and found the kitchen. The stove was cold. She had the fire going and water heating, and what she could find of a breakfast, corn flour, 2 eggs, a heel of cured meat, on the table before Garrett came through. He stopped in the doorway. Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't have said what. He looked at the table, at the steam rising from the pot, at her standing by the stove with a cloth wrapped around her hand. He said she didn't have to do that. She said she was aware of it. She said she didn't take charity lying down, so if she was eating here she would earn it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read. Then he sat down at the table and ate. At the table, Lydia sat across from Nora and said nothing for the first part of the meal. Then she asked where Nora was from. Nora said Missouri. Lydia said she had a cousin in Missouri once. She did not say where the cousin had gone. It was not much, but it was something. Garrett took her into Cedar Ridge that morning to send telegraphs. He drove the wagon in a silence that was not unfriendly, just contained, the way his silences were. At the telegraph office, the clerk said it would take a day, at least, to get responses from neighboring counties. Nora sent 3 messages, one to the circuit administrator, one to the General Postal Service, one to the Employment Bureau, through which she had supposedly been matched with Amos Bell. While they waited, she became aware of how a small town registers the presence of a stranger. Eyes at windows, conversations that quieted as they passed. She was a woman she did not know yet, arriving in a wagon with a man she did not know yet, and the town was making of that what towns make of such things. At the general store, a woman named Martha Vale looked at her over the counter with the careful assessment of a woman who has seen many things come through a small town and has opinions about most of them. She looked at the envelope Nora was holding, and something changed in her expression. Not suspicion exactly, more like recognition. She said the seal on the envelope looked like something she'd seen before. She did not say more than that. Not yet. Across the room, a man was holding court near the cold stove. He was well dressed, with the easy authority of a man accustomed to deference. His name was Silas Creel, and he managed Rocking V Ranch, which was the largest and most prosperous operation in the valley. He came over to them with the kind of smile that has been practiced until it looks natural. He expressed concern for Nora in the way that people express concern when they mean to create discomfort. He said it was troubling, of course, a young woman alone in unfamiliar country, and perhaps if Garrett's arrangement wasn't quite what it should be, there were other places in town where she might find more suitable accommodations. He let the implication sit in the air between them. Garrett said nothing. He looked at Creel, the way a man looks at something he doesn't want to touch with his hands. They walked out. The implication stayed. That night Lydia found Nora in the kitchen after dinner, washing the plates. Lydia picked up a cloth and began to dry them, and after a while she said that her brother was a good man. She said this the way people say things they believe but are not certain how to prove. Nora said she had no reason to doubt it. Lydia said the house had been different since their mother died and their father after her. She said Garrett had been running it alone for 3 years and had gotten good at keeping things going by keeping things cold, and that was the best she knew how to describe it. Nora asked what Lydia herself had lost. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said there had been a man who had been supposed to marry her, but that when their circumstances changed, He had found reasons not to follow through. She said it in a tone that suggested she had made a kind of peace with it, even if the peace was provisional. Nora thought about that. She thought about all the things that get called peace, when what they really are is just the absence of any better available option. She said she understood that. Lydia looked at her. Then she went back to drying the plates, and when she left the kitchen she walked a little more slowly than when she had come in, the way people move when they have been given something small to carry. In the days that followed, Nora found a way to be useful without making herself unavoidable. She cooked what was there to cook, cleaned what needed cleaning, kept a careful distance from the things that belonged to the house's history, rather than its present. She did not rearrange the furniture. She did not ask about the photograph on the mantel. She set her own things only in the scissor room and the kitchen, and she moved through the rest of the house like a tenant who is conscious of the lease. Lydia watched this. One morning she found Nora in the parlor, not sitting, but standing before the window with a cloth in her hand and the curtains half drawn for cleaning, holding the fabric carefully as though she was aware it might have meaning she couldn't see. Lydia said those were her mother's curtains. Nora said she had thought they might be. She said she would leave them if Lydia preferred. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said her mother had been very particular about curtains. She said her mother had believed that the way a window was dressed told you everything about how a house felt about the light it let in. Nora said that was an interesting way to think about it. Lydia came and took the other end of the curtain and helped her hang it back. They worked in silence. Nora noticed that Lydia's hands were careful and practiced, the hands of someone who had been tending things a long time. Later that week Nora found, pushed to the back of the sewing basket in the parlor, a piece of needlework that had been started and abandoned. It was a handkerchief, good linen, with a pattern begun in pale thread. The work was fine where it had been done, but it had been put away mid-stitch. The needle still threaded and drawn through a corner of the fabric, as though the person sewing it had been interrupted, and simply never returned. She did not touch it. She asked Lydia at supper if it belonged to anyone. Lydia looked at her plate. She said she had started for the autumn fair a few years back, and then had stopped. Nora said it was beautiful work. Lydia said she hadn't felt like finishing it. There was a pause in which both of them understood a great deal without saying it. Nora said she was very good with fine thread, if Lydia ever wanted help completing it. She said she would not change any of the pattern, only follow where it had been going. Lydia did not answer that evening, but 3 nights later, she came to Nora's room after supper with the handkerchief in her hand. They sat by the lamp and worked together in silence, and the silence was the kind that comes when 2 people have decided, without declaring it, that they are no longer strangers. Garrett passed the door and saw the 2 of them bent over their work. He went on to his own room without speaking. He sat in the dark for a while. He had not seen Lydia bent over her needlework in 3 years. He had not realized, until this moment, that he had been waiting for it without knowing he was waiting. The telegraph responses came back the second day. No one named Amos Bell was registered as a property owner in the surrounding counties. No Silver Creek Ranch appeared in any active land records. The Employment Bureau had no record of matching Nora Whitcomb with anyone in Montana Territory. Garrett read the messages. He handed them to Nora without comment. She read them on the porch. She stood very still for a while. The wind moved through the grass in the pasture below the house. She was not thinking about what to do next. She was thinking about a name on a piece of paper that someone had used to move her, like a piece in a game she hadn't known she was playing. She said, very quietly, that she had been a fool. Garrett, behind her, said one careful word, no. He said a person in difficult circumstances had a right to believe a door that opened in front of them. He said something had been done deliberately to her, and the question was not why she had fallen for it, but who had found it useful that she should. He stood beside her on the porch. He did not touch her, but there was something in the way he came to stand beside her, rather than behind her, or in front of her, that she noticed. Silas Creel, meanwhile, had begun to move. Word traveled in Cedar Ridge, the way it travels in all small towns, efficiently and without regard for accuracy, and within 2 days the version circulating had evolved from a simple misunderstanding into something considerably more dramatic. A woman alone in Garrett Lane's house. No one who could vouch for her story. The widow of some people were calling her, which was unkind in 3 different directions. Martha Vale in her store heard the talk and thought about the envelope seal. She had seen that seal before. The small embossed V, the particular press of it, slightly off-center. She had seen it on paperwork that had come through the store in connection with Rocking V Ranch, which was Silas Creel's operation. She sent a message to Hollow Bend. Garrett read it by lamplight. He set it down on the table and sat with it a while. Nora came in from the hallway and looked at his expression and waited. He said he thought he knew what had happened. He said he thought Creel had done it, and he thought he knew why. He had been refusing to sell the water rights on Hollow Bend for 2 years. Water in a dry valley is not a small thing. The man who controls the source controls the cattle operations that depend on it, and Creel had been trying to find a way to lever Garrett off his position, and the most direct available lever was Garrett's reputation. A scandal was a lever. A woman with no verifiable story, appearing at a widower's ranch without warning or explanation, was a scandal. Nora listened to all of this, and then said that she had been used as a piece in someone else's game, and that she found this unacceptable. She said it with a calm that was more intimidating than anger. She said she intended to be of some use in correcting it. Garrett looked at her for a moment. He said that was entirely up to her. He said he wasn't going to tell a woman, whose situation he had no part in creating, that she ought to be grateful for what protection he could offer, and leave the rest alone. She said she had not intended to be told any such thing. He almost smiled. It was a near thing. The autumn fair at Cedar Ridge brought most of the county into town. Lydia had been embroidering a handkerchief for months, working on it in small pieces and then setting it aside, because it had been begun, during a period she did not want to commemorate. Nora, in the weeks at Hollow Bend, had sat with her in the evenings and helped her finish it. It was a fine piece of work, pale thread on good linen, and Lydia brought it to the fair with a kind of cautious pride. At the fairgrounds, Silas Creel found his moment. He was good at moments. He had the rancher's gift of patience, the kind that comes from watching weather long enough to know when to move. He chose a crowded passage between the stalls where plenty of people would hear, and he spoke in his pleasant, concerned voice about the unfortunate situation at Hollow Bend, about the peculiar circumstances of Miss Whitcomb's arrival, about the difficulty of trusting a man to manage common resources when his own household was in such obvious disorder. He looked at Nora when he said it. She looked back at him. She said, in a voice she had kept steady through harder things than this, that she had been brought to Cedar Ridge by a false letter, deposited at a ranch she had never heard of, and offered nothing from the man who owned it, except a place to sleep while the situation was investigated. She said that if the town found this suspicious, it might be worth considering who had arranged for it to look that way. The crowd was very quiet. Garrett stepped up beside her. He did not speak. He simply stood there, which was a kind of speech. He said eventually that protecting a woman who had been used against his household was not disorder. He said that a town they called honesty disorder had been listening to someone with a reason to confuse the two. Creel recovered quickly. He was good at recovery, but something in the crowd had shifted, something in the quality of the silence, and he knew it. He moved on. Martha Vale came to Hollow Bend the following day with the envelope and a piece of wax she had kept behind the counter. She pressed it against the corner of the envelope, and the impression matched perfectly. The same slightly off-center V, the same density in the press. She had brought also an invoice from Rocking V Ranch that had come through her store 2 months ago, one that bore the same seal. Nora looked at the two impressions for a long time. Then she turned the letter over. On the back, in the bottom corner, barely visible, was a faint ghost impression. It was the impression the sealing wax had left on a piece of paper underneath. The kind of thing you get when a letter is sealed on top of another document that has not finished drying. It was a partial impression of a brand, the Rocking V brand. The town council meeting was called the following week, at Creel's insistence. He had been pressing the case that Garrett's water rights should be reviewed by the council on grounds of community standing, which was a sufficiently vague claim that it could be argued any number of ways. He came to the meeting in a good coat, with the assurance of a man who has set the table and knows where everyone will sit. Nora sat at the back. She had the envelope in her lap. She had Martha's invoice beside it. She had also 3 days of her own careful handwriting, tracking the impressions, the paper quality, the ink, the particular way the letter had been folded. Creel spoke for some time. He spoke about the water rights and the community interest and the question of Garrett's suitability to hold a resource that affected the whole valley. He brought the matter of Nora up with an air of reluctant necessity, saying only that it was an unusual situation, and that unusual situations sometimes indicated deeper instability. Nora stood up. The council chair looked at her. He was the kind of man who ran on order, and order said the person on the floor had the floor. He let her speak. She said the letter she had received, the letter that had brought her to Cedar Ridge, bore a seal that matched the Rocking V Ranch's correspondence seal. She put the envelope on the table. She put Martha's invoice beside it. She explained the ghost impression on the back. She said the name Amos Bell appeared on a gravestone in the cemetery north of town. She said she had been there and seen it herself. She said the man who had written to her was either a ghost or someone who had borrowed a dead man's name to create a fiction. Silas Creel said the evidence was circumstantial. He said any number of people might use similar seals. Jasper Finch stood up. He had come in late and sat near the door, and nobody had particularly noticed him. He was not a man who invited notice. He stood up with the stiff movements of a person doing something they have been putting off for days, and he said, in a voice that was somewhat steadier than his hands, that he had been paid by Silas Creel to drive a woman to Hollow Bend Ranch instead of Silver Creek Ranch, which was the address on her ticket. He said he had been told the manifest would be adjusted. He said he had done it for money, and that it had not sat well with him, and that he was saying so now, because the woman he had left in the road was standing in front of him, and had told him the truth was still there, to be said if he was willing to say it. The room was very quiet. The council chair asked Creel if he had a response. Creel had no response that would help him. The motion about the water rights was tabled. A separate inquiry was opened. Creel left the room with the measured walk of a man who knows he is being watched and refuses to hurry. Garrett was outside when the meeting ended. He was leaning against the fence post in the early evening, and when Nora came out, he looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said that she had done well. She said she had done what was in front of her. He said that was how he had always thought about it too. They stood in the fading light a while. Inside, Lydia was talking with Martha Vale over a cup of tea. The handkerchief was on the table. Martha said it was lovely work. A few days later, Nora packed her bag. She was not running. She was thinking. The crisis was over, and the obligation was resolved, and she was 25 years old, and had not been particularly asked to stay, only to stop, and she had stopped, and now she was standing in a room with her bag packed, wondering whether staying required asking. She was in the hallway when Garrett found her. He looked at the bag. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said he had spent 3 years making Hollow Bend into a place that didn't need anyone, and that he had been successful at it in most of the ways a man could count, and that he had not understood until recently what the cost of that success was. He said she had not come to his door in a way either of them would have chosen. He said he was glad she had come. He said he was not asking her to stay because she had been useful, or because she had solved a problem for him, or because the house was quieter with her in it than with her gone, though all of those things were true. He said he was asking her to stay because she was the first person in 3 years who had looked at the house and at him and not looked away. She set the bag down. She said she wanted to hear him say it without qualifications. He looked at her straight. He said, "I am asking you to stay because I want you here, not because I need you useful, and I have never said that to anyone, and I mean it as plainly as I know how." She left the bag where it was. They walked out to the creek that evening, to the place where the willows grew along the bank, and the water moved through the stones in the easy way it had moved for 100 years, and would move for 100 more. Garrett said this was where his wife used to come, in the mornings when she wanted to think. He said it without grief, or rather with the kind of grief that has been lived with long enough to become companionable. He took from his pocket a ring that had been his mother's, a plain silver band, thin with age. He held it in his palm. He said she had the right to say no. He said if she wanted time, he would give her time, and if she wanted to go somewhere and start again from a better starting point than a forgery and a stranger's gate, he would help her do that. She looked at the ring. She said she had come 3 days from Missouri on the word of a dead man's name, and she had found something real at the end of it, and she was not in the habit of walking away from real things. She held out her hand. They were married in the wooden church at Cedar Ridge. 3 weeks later, with Martha Vale wiping her eyes at the back, and Jasper Finch standing in the doorway, with a bunch of wildflowers he had cut himself, not quite daring to come in but not able to stay away either. Lydia laid the finished handkerchief on the altar table, open, the pale embroidery catching the light from the window. Silas Creel lost his claim to the water rights. The inquiry produced sufficient evidence of manipulation that the council was not inclined to do him any further favors. The cedar tree by the creek grew another year's rings, and in the evenings, when the light was down and the valley was settling into dark, the windows of Hollow Bend Ranch showed yellow and warm against the hill, and inside the kitchen there was the sound of 2 people moving in a space that had learned, at last, what it was for. Some paths begin in lies, some wrong roads open at the right moment, and sometimes the place you were sent to in error turns out to be the only place that would have had you as yourself. Not the person someone needed, not the solution to someone's problem. The person someone chose to look at and did not look away from, and asked to stay. Thank you for watching. This channel is no longer supported by ads, and these stories continue because people believe they matter. Patreon is a quiet way to support the work with early access, story previews, and small moments of input before each tale is fully told. On screen now is a preview of the Patreon page. If you'd like to support the channel, the invitation is in the first pinned comment down below. I'll see you in the next story.